Good evening, everybody. Welcome to our webinar, our Division of Clinical Associates webinar. We're really excited to have everybody here for us to commemorate, or rather to sign off on the Mental Health Awareness Month by having our webinar discussion on Chemsex and consent in South Africa towards trauma-informed care and exclusive practices in higher education. All right, so my name is Daniela Goeieman. I'm your host for today, and I've got some wonderful speakers here. So the session brings together voices from lived experience, the legal fraternity, as well as our LGBTQ plus health programming officers, and also educators within Wits. And so we're hoping that this discussion, we are able to look at the complex intersections of substance use, sexual consent, and gender-based violence. So we gathered a critical moment where we've just had the South African Journal of HIV Medicine produce harm reduction guidelines for Chemsex, as well as our colleagues from the Wits Center of Applied Legal Studies are challenging at the Constitutional Court the fact that prosecutors and sexual violence victims have to argue non-consent within sexual violence cases. So with regards to the guidelines, they primarily aimed at clinicians, so doctors, nurses, and clinical associates. And these guidelines also speak to the responsibilities of pharmacists, psychologists, social workers, program officers, peer outreach workers. And the guidelines remind us not to pathologize Chemsex participation through a moral judgment, because as registered healthcare providers, our professional privilege is there, but we also have a constitutional and ethical responsibility to uphold dignity, equity, and justice in care. So as a division that teaches within a biopsychosocial framework, we aim to develop students as systems thinkers as well. And so we believe it's essential that these issues are critically discussed and looked at. And so we understand that Chemsex is not just a clinical matter, but a social, legal, and ethical one. So when we came across Chemsex and we spoke to people like some of our speakers that we have here, we realized that shucks, there's so many things around stigma, silence, and institutional norms that shape the experience of marginalized communities or people that might participate in Chemsex. And so we're hoping that we humanize the conversation by centering lived experience, and we raise awareness about Chemsex and its limitations for understanding consent, particularly within LGBTQ plus communities, be it faculty or students. Before we begin, before I hand over to our speaker, I want to affirm that this webinar is a safe and inclusive space for open dialogue and learning and reflection. So the session might include explicit language and references to sexual practices and substance use. So these discussions are not intended to shock or offend, but to reflect the lived realities of communities we're engaging with. So using authentic language, we will deepen our understanding, and we don't want to sanitize experiences that are often marginalized and misunderstood. I'm going to post in the chat a language guide as well from the International Network on Health and Hepatitis and Substance Users, because language is powerful. And language can be stigmatizing and judgmental and create barriers to care and discourage people from accessing support that they need. And that hopefully you use the language guide beyond this webinar, in classrooms, clinics, and communities. And so as we gather here as community members from the Faculty of Health Sciences here at Wits, and to anybody who's from the external community in the university or other institutions, organizations, we're hoping that we have a diverse and dynamic discussion. So without wasting more time, I'm going to hand over to Uzve with him to start his presentation. And he's going to be talking to us about the concept of Chemsex within the South African context.
yeah, I'll just jump right into it because we have quite a lot to cover in this short amount of time, but I really appreciate everyone for taking the time out to come to a space of learning today. So, when we're speaking about sexualized drug use and chemsex, just to jump right off the bat into it, let's understand what we're actually speaking about. When we're talking about sexualized drug use, I'd like us to think of it as a big umbrella or a circle, rather, large circle, where all kinds of sexual practice happen. And so within sexualized drug use, this is particularly where this broad umbrella encompasses any kind of substance or psychoactive. Now, a psychoactive is basically any mind-altering substance. This can include alcohol. This can include cannabis. Anything that you use to facilitate or even make the sex a little bit better, enhance it. And when we speak about chemsex, to differentiate between the two, we zero in under this big broad umbrella or within the circle of sexualized drug use practice, there is a little dot, a smaller circle where chemsex is defining the practices where particularly LGBT, the gay, bisexual, as well as men who have sex with men, whether identifying or not, will participate, as well as transgender people. Now, within this little bubble of sexual practice, we are using a very specific amount of drugs, as well as we are using intention. So that's our first differentiating mark. With sexualized drug use, it is most probably any intoxicating substance, whereas with chemsex, we're only speaking about a very small subset of drugs. And then the second differentiating factor is the fact that with sexualized drug use, it might just happen off the bat. You know, you might be in a club, you might see someone from across the room that you think, oh, that person looks like a nice person to take home tonight, but you need a little bit of courage. So you down a little bit of alcohol and then big bada boom, at the end of the night, here you are together. That alcohol that allowed you to facilitate the sex, that is what allows the entire interaction to be deemed from a clinical point of view as sexualized drug use. Whereas with chemsex, there's a very specific intention to use the drug in order for the sex to happen. So as you'll see there in my definition, I've tried to point out that the keywords with chemsex are, first and foremost, specific intention, and then secondly, a specific amount of drugs or a specific type of drugs. Now, going into the specific types of drugs, we have right off the bat three, only those three. The three that I'm mentioning are crystal methamphetamine. So on the street, we call it crystal. A much more modern term is Tina. Some people will call it meth, or if you're maybe in the Western Cape, you'll hear about it as tick, or tick. Yeah. And then when we come to, before I leave crystal methamphetamine, just the effects of it. Overall, it's that it's an energy enhancer or energy booster and will most likely give you sexual arousal for hours on end. Going into gamma hydroxybutyrate or GHB, as it's more commonly known, this is a colorless, odorless liquid. And so the only differentiating factor with it within the human body that you're able to pick up that you've had GHB is firstly the effect. The effect of it is similarly to crystal, an energy enhancer. But now with gamma hydroxybutyrate or GHB, that energy is a very specific psychoactive kind. It's just to, paint a little bit of a picture more visually for people. It allows you to see colors a lot more brighter. It allows you to feel music from as if it's coming from inside of your chest, Even if someone touches you on the arm or anywhere, it feels as though little electrical signals are rushing through your entire body. So this liquid is quite dangerous in a sense because one drop will equal that nice time effect, if I'll put it like that. But two or more drops, and this is where it becomes overstimulating for the mind, and it becomes well, actually, the substance that's going to make your mind, in a sense, black out. And that's how you know that you've had GHB into your drink, which is also, just to put it out there, why it is more commonly used in the streets or in club settings as a date rape drug. It is very, very effective. It is very quick to act, and the effect of it can last for hours. We then follow rather with our last chemsex drug, which is known as methcathinone, or in the street we will call it cat. And similar to crystal methamphetamine, it is most likely to boost only energy. Some people do report that it does also cause sexual arousal. This might be because methcathinone as well as crystal methamphetamine belong to the same category or family of drugs. And so, depending on the country that you are in, there's a much more broader sense of which drugs go along with chemsex. This will be most probably in the global north. This will include your cocaine. This will include ketamine. If you've ever heard about ketamine, back when I was in vet school, this was used as a horse tranquilizer. It's a very, very strong psychoactive substance. And so it's a sedative as well. And that means that it's just going to make you, while your mind is active, your body will feel extremely, extremely relaxed. Ecstasy or MDMA is also a very common substance that goes along with these. And so, not to spend too much time on these drugs, I will just mention as additional substances, those that go along with chemsex is usually cannabis. We usually have mandrax, which is also known as buttons in the Western Cape. Alcohol, of course, erectile dysfunction medication, sildenafil to be more specific, or Viagra, as it's more commonly known. And then we will also include poppers. Now, these last category of drugs, from cannabis to poppers, that I've mentioned, is a combination of substances. And that's something that we should always remember, that rarely in a chemsex situation will you find one drug being active. It's usually starting off on one and then moving into, as the night progresses, a bunch of other drugs. Now, remembering again that there's a very specific intention that goes along with chemsex, you might be asking yourself, well, how does this all look? It will commonly look like, just to use myself as an example, Sive getting up and saying, hey, I want to have a nice time today, but I don't think I can do it on my own. I don't think I have the confidence or the energy, etc. And so I'll go first to someone who will be providing, aka a dealer, and purchase this substance, whichever of the ones I've just mentioned. And so this is done with that specific intention in order to facilitate the sex, remember, happening. It's done to improve or enhance the sex to make it feel much better. And it's also done most commonly to extend the lifetime of sex. So, in a sense, your 2 minute noodle goes into 2 hour blockbuster. Now, how it also looks is that usually in a chemsex setting, there will be casual sex partners or multiple sex partners, rather. There will also be most likely group sex, and this can last rather for hours or even days, depending on the setting that you're in. How it's also characterized is that there will be unprotected sex, most likely, because often when we're high and sensation seeking, the last thing on our minds is added protection. And this is where people like me come in and say, hey, I have a job. I can remind people this is how you become safer when you are engaging in sex. That has substances involved. Now, in the global north, usually chemsex happens a lot online. There's a multitude of apps and websites that happen. We might know of a few called Grindr, Tinder, maybe Ads Africa, if you're much more old school like myself. Or we can also see lost characteristic, which is very specific to South Africa, the offline interaction or the networks that happen specifically in lower social economic areas. This is basically a house where in a lower in an LSM area, lower socio-economic area, you might be walking by someone's house and thinking, oh yeah, Maki's having a nice time, there's a party. But in the back, it's been happening for days and days, that someone or some people rather are having sex. So this yeah, this is one of the characteristics that we can see chemsex with. You might be asking yourself why all of this happened. And this is where that humanistic aspect really, really comes in. I want to remind everybody today that, firstly, no one engages in chemsex in order to get hurt. You do so in order to feel alive or a sense thereof. You might do so in order to enhance desire, to make that pleasure, that intimacy, or even that stamina, your sexual performance, which we know for, at least from the world that I come in from in public health, the MSM world, we know that stamina is usually one of the sore points that comes along with sex, as well as impacts one's mental health. So chemsex does then offer that respite. It does offer also a sense of belonging. There's a greater community of people that are using drugs you may or may not be aware of. They might be in a professional setting, there we go, or in the background be using chems for their own purposes in order to escape something, in order to feel a sense of sexual confidence. And then most likely also in the case of receptive anal sex, you might be engaging in chems in order to feel less pain, which we know is part of the characteristics of anal sex. So all of this is just to say that people describe chemsex as something that allows them to feel connected to someone. It's something that allows them to feel completely uninhibited, to explore, to do everything that they maybe have wanted to do, but haven't had a chance to or confidence to. And it allows people to feel a sense of acceptance in spaces. One other characteristic, or rather reason to opt for chemsex that usually is reported is that there's a socioeconomic factor, and this is particularly here in South Africa where we've observed sex workers who are able to have casual sex with strangers or clients on chems that much easier for them to engage in. So remember that socioeconomic factor means that if I'm a sex worker, I am able to put, well, food on the table. I'm able to give money to my family, whether they know or don't know of my drug use that goes along with it. And in some senses, it actually eases the psyche as well and allows for a cognitive disengagement from day-to-day concerns. Now, these concerns, socioeconomically, of course, are financial concerns, as well as in some cases, especially when one is open about their profession, that ostracism that usually happens from the family and greater society. So I'll just go right into the risks. But yeah, going into the techniques and administrations, as well as the risks that go along with it, there are a multitude of drugs. I can't cover every drug because one is popping up every day. However, the ways in which to take drugs, because we have a limited amount of bodily entrances, that would be the word. Those are limited. So rather, let me just go into those. So slamming is a very common street term for injecting drug use. And as you can see, I've mentioned the IVI, IMI, which stand for intravenous slamming or intravenous injecting, as well as intramuscular injecting, IMI. There is also subcutaneous cutting, which means that I basically open up the skin like with a blade, and then I pop the drug underneath, and then I patch up the skin. And what that allows people to do is that it dissolves the drug that much slower to get into the bloodstream, and then they start feeling the psychoactive effect. Going into snorting, I think we all know what that is. It's nasal ingestion. And then we can follow it up with smoking. Now, smoking usually happens in two common ways, which is with a dry pipe, with dry smoking, which is a pipe, or wet smoking, which is use of a hubbly bubbly. We also have launching, which is rectal launching, which is basically inserting the drug as if one is taking an enema up the rectum. And you might be asking yourself, why would anyone do that? Well, it's actually a much more safer means of taking drugs and much less conspicuous to others who are observing, because with just to kind of compare the two, with slamming or injecting, I might inject myself incorrectly and then have a bump or a bruise, as I've noted there in one of the risks. Whereas when it comes to launching, nobody knows that I've taken my drug. I simply have taken an enema and I'm feeling the effects. And so with professionals, I've noted that's usually the go-to method. Lastly is our most concerning method for people who are in the younger demographic, drinking drugs. And this happens either pure by just taking the drug and then, taking whatever other liquid substance, or it will happen diluted, which is when now it is mixed in with your cocktail, with your orange juice, with your alcohol. And this is very, very concerning because this is usually how people are spiked. I won't go into all of the risks as we don't have too much time, but I want to just note there in our last row that with all of these methods, there's a very high likelihood of overdose. In the case of slamming, there is, because of the directness of the intake method, there is also a usually effect that happens over time, whereas drug-induced psychoses start showing up. And this is particularly in a stage where the drug is leaving the system. We call it the come down stage, where you've been high for so long, or you've been high up in the clouds, enjoying yourself. And then now as the drug starts to leave your system, it becomes a little bit harder to deal with reality. I will maybe go into that a little bit better further on in the presentation. But something else to note in terms of the techniques and risks, all of this that I'm speaking about is from a very comprehensive study that myself, as well as a couple of other like-minded clinicians, psychologists, all healthcare workers, basically, who are concerned with chemsex, decided to do before the formulation of the Chemsex guidelines. It was actually to inform the guidelines. This is a values and preference research. I've just shortened it there. And the study was conducted over 6 months in both Johannesburg and Cape Town, being the most drug ingesting metropolitan areas in the country. It involved about 50% of African gentlemen, 20% colored, 30% white, from all strata of life. And what I mean there is one was a doctor, one was a person who was unemployed, one was a sex worker, one was, coming from different kinds of backgrounds. So it really, really was a study where we tried to get in as many different perspectives as possible. The most important thing I think to note there is that we found that with crystal meth in that population of people that we were having, we found 100% usage rate. Everybody had at least once within the past 6 months used or tried using crystal meth. GHB was a close follow-up, cocaine as well, MDMA, as well as poppers right at the end. And so I'm noting this because unlike the global north, where injecting practices are the leading way of taking in substances for sex, at least, here in South Africa, we like smoking. We smoke a little bit more. So those are the intake methods that I've also noted there in their various percentages. And just again, to reassure everybody of how widespread this entire practice is, within these 35 gentlemen that we had gathered and interviewed over key informant interviews as well as focus groups, we noted within a period of 6 months, over 150 chemsex encounters. So this really just goes to show that chemsex is a lot more widespread than you might initially think. Just to go a little bit into visuals there, I won't spend too much time on it. It's just a bell curve showing the age ranges that chemsex would start from anything in the 20s up until the late 50s. With all kinds of educational backgrounds, whether it was a matriculant, someone who'd only matriculated, or someone who was tertiary educated. So really any and everybody can, and usually does, do chemsex in their spare time. Now, moving on to why we're gathered here, when it becomes problematic. Now, I usually try and give as much practical safety in my trainings to both healthcare practitioners as well as the community at large. That's something I wanted to bring in here today. Firstly, to differentiate or be able to see when chemsex is actually starting to become not too nice anymore, but more of a dependency and more of something that is producing anxiety. Firstly, just noting that not everyone who engages in chemsex needs treatment, I will say that everyone who does engage in it needs some form of support, someone to talk to, someone to provide information on safer use, on safe spaces. I will like to say that, of course, chemsex does also interact, and this is something that we have to remember as empathetic healthcare workers. It does interact with a lot of sexuality-based stigma. It's a fear for most men who are having sex with other men to be outed within the community. It's often dangerous and life-threatening in some cases. I come from the Eastern Cape, and in a township we call Mdantsane, which is quite large, we also have the highest rate of homophobic murders that are happening. So you can probably see why it would be very hard for someone to just want to be out in most cases. And so chemsex sometimes offers a little bit of a respite, but it does have that drawback of stigma being based on one's sexuality. Noting that it's a bit problematic when it goes on for hours or days, because that leaves absolutely no room for people to take breaks, physical or mentally. It doesn't leave the body any time to recover. And so when one doesn't have a chance to have also an emotional balance that is coming in, those highs and the lows, the cycle that it produces is usually a mental health disorder precursor. So some of the signs of chemsex, if you maybe are engaging in it, or if you know someone that might be, some of the signs of it becoming problematic are those that I have noted just there, which is that it is anxiety producing over the long run. It does have an element of dependency, and you might see that you're starting to miss overall commitments, your personal, work, or school otherwise. And then also when it comes to problematic use, um, something else to also note is that we look at consent being the highlight of the issue. Some participants within our study, which is what's informing me mostly, is the issue of the fact that, when they wanted to address a lot of consent, they couldn't. They had a loss of memory, a loss of consciousness. They had gaps in their memory after sessions. And so if you remember some of those psychoactive substances that I mentioned, like GHB, that is exactly why someone would have those kinds of issues, being able to recount whether they consented to the sex happening or not. Just to use that study as a reference, when we looked at it, 51% of the people that we were speaking to were recounting exactly these kinds of incidents. And when we asked them, so did you have someone to speak to, a legal authority, someone to go to? Only 43% of them were saying, well, yeah, no, not really, because when I go to the police, when I go to speak to some of my friends, there's no trust. When I go to speak to the police, the legality of the entire interaction becomes an issue, because the police are going to turn around and say, well, why were you engaging in an illicit substance? In fact, when we spoke to these gentlemen, two of them actually came to me and said, yeah, when I did report it, the one time I did, I actually faced charges myself. One of them is actually still going through those charges. So I the quote that they use, which I decided to just put in here for reference sake, is why would you even, who would you even tell when you're in a room that has everybody who's high? How do you prove that what you are thinking happened actually happened? And so this is something that I'd like people to consider at a stage. It's that consent consideration, which is being in a chemsex session, which was intentional. Is being in a chemsex session consent enough? Is every encounter, or rather, is every encounter, whether you're intoxicated or otherwise, is that the barometer for whether one is consenting or not? And so with consent, one of the biggest issues, I'll just highlight four to save us all time, but give us as much knowledge as possible. One of the biggest issues is those blurred consent lines that I was just trying to highlight in the previous slide. Many people are reporting that they are intoxicated at the time, so they don't know whether they should, withdraw consent, or just being there is enough reason to say, okay, well, do whatever is needed. Some people don't even remember what was happening at the time. And sometimes you might say yes in the beginning, but then you're so high. These are actually the words now that was spoken to me. You might be so high in the beginning that you can't really stop. Even if you want to, you can feel a sense of it in your heart or in your mind, but then your body is just too strung out or high in order to be able to say, I've had enough. So these are some of the fluid or conditional conditions that I will leave for Dr. Sheena to be able to let us consider further in the legal reporting. When we come to consent, secondly, we have a fear and reluctance. Like I was mentioning, that participants in our study, they told us that when we go to the police, there's usually a reversal of the issue. You become, as the person who's reporting, now complicit in the illegal activity, which is having drugs present. One person actually told us that they were robbed and they are fully cognizant of the fact that they were raped, but they didn't bother to go to the police because they knew that when they get there, as a result of the area that they live from, a lower socioeconomic area, they would have been asked at the precinct, why were you engaging with men? Why were you having these kinds of interactions in the first place? And so that person ultimately just had to try and forget on their own. This is not one person's experience. This is several people. With my last two consent considerations, I would like to, I'll maybe skip a little bit over these because I've spoken about them, the physical and the legal vulnerabilities, as well as the lack of access to non-judgmental reporting channels. This is something that we have to deal with, and that is very stigmatized on a very widespread level here in the country. And so if Dr. Sheena will consent, that is definitely an area we will explore much deeper in her session. But before I leave you, I will like to just put in a couple of those. Please do take a screenshot or a picture. These are some of my personal practical methods that I always advise. I will highlight only a couple, which is that if you are intentionally engaging in substance use for your sex life, avoid mixing, especially those depressant substances like GHB and alcohol. Why I say this is because those particular two in combination are known to induce cardiac arrest or to make the brain so overstimulated that one might lose memory or blackout. I will always encourage for safer adoption of sexual health practices like regular STI and HIV screening, as well as for people to support one another, without any form of judgment. And if you're practicing any one of these methods, I would like to remind you that you are engaging in harm reduction. Most importantly, I always say is to, after your session, eat something to re-nourish the body, hydrate, and then rest. You can always make the body rest. Even if you don't feel like sleeping, close your curtains, put your phone on do not disturb. Your family and other people, you can just let them know, hey, I'm out of commission for a couple of hours. But that rest is so key because it allows your body physical recovery as well as your mind to mentally come down from everything safely. And so just a few other helpful resources. I have put out Wellbeing's number right there at the top. We offer 3 telephone lines, which unfortunately now because of funds only happen from Monday to Friday, but you are most welcome to use them as both a telephone line as well as a WhatsApp line should you ever want to get some advice on chemsex, how to use safer, or if you just want someone who is a support to speak to. They are, of course, in other metropolitan areas like the Nelson Mandela Bay area, the Free State area, those organizations that I have listed there. You're most welcome to take those details as well. And I think, just for added effect, I will put them in the chat as well, just to ensure that everybody does have a safe resource nearby, whether it's for physical health or mental health, as my slide shows here. And let me close off with the very, very last of those safe spaces, noting that each and every one of these organizations has worked with harm reduction before, either through a sensitization training or by incorporating that into their daily services. So yeah, let me end off right there today. And thank you very much for taking the time to be with us. Back to you, Daniela.
Thank you so much, Sive. So now we're going to introduce Dorian Basson, Senior Finance Officer at Gender Dynamics, person with lived experience and an HIV activist. But before we start with, before Dorian speaks to us, we're just going to play a 3-minute video in which Dorian shares his lived experience.
My name is Dorian Peter Basson and I reside in Mitchells Plain, Cape Town. It was late October when I had been walking home and I was dragged into the bushes from behind by a male, and he sexually assaulted me. I never told anyone because I was just too ashamed. It was the 5th of December of the whole World AIDS Day celebrations, events, and the work nurse was there for a visit. And I will never forget the look on her face. I could see in her eyes. It was a done deal. It did not even come across my mind that I would have been at risk of being infected by HIV or STI. Those were heavy burdens for a young person to bear. Something completely flipped. I had the mental breakdown of drugs, sex. I was trying to fill a hole. I had my second mental breakdown after 2 years of being on ARV in silence. I landed up at Coetzee Psychiatric Hospital. I remember waking up on a mattress and blue government blanket. And I remember bursting out and kind of crying and saying, I need my ARVs, otherwise I'm going to die. I haven't had it for 7 days. And no one knew that I had all this extra medication to take. That was the first time I voiced it for 2 years. I remember my mom and my sister coming in, and I honestly thought my mother was going to kill me. And I couldn't say it. I will never forget her response. You're my child, and I love you all the way, the same way I did the day I gave birth to you. It was a full circle moment for me. After that, things changed, and they changed for the better. People often ask me, 12 years later, you're still around? What did you do differently? I said, nothing. I continued living.
Test today, treat today, live tomorrow. For more information, go to your nearest clinic or call the AIDS helpline on 0800 0123 22. Zenzele, the future's ours.
Hey, over to you, Dorian. Thank you so much for being here this evening.
Hi, good evening, everybody. I'm so happy to be here, Daniela. I think that every time I see that video, and it's been 8 years since we had done that documentary, every time I see it, I get a bit emotional because it's my lived reality. And this year, on the 5th of December, I will celebrate 20 years of living with HIV. And I didn't think I would make it. I honestly didn't think I would make it. Those first few years of after the rape and the diagnosis, I was a young student. I just turned 21 and I was the top student at UWC in the and I was studying a Bachelor of Finance Accounting, and I was the top student, and I just received the Golden Key International Award, and then the rape happened, and my academic career got cut short, and then life ended really for me. But then came the HIV diagnosis, and that was something I could not handle. I I remember that I'd used drugs and alcohol really as a means of affirmation, as a means of trying to feel alive. It gave me an increased confidence. It made me forget the realities that actually was my reality at the time. And that was that I had been raped and that I had been diagnosed with HIV and that I had been diagnosed with bipolar mood disorder as a result of, the rape. Mentally, I couldn't handle all of that happening at the same time. And so I turned to substance use as a way of diminishing the reality I was facing at the time. And so pointed out so accurately, the various ways that substances could be consumed, and there wasn't any of those that he mentioned that I had not tried. And so I think looking back now, I wish that I knew about harm reduction first of all. But also, I wish that in that first few years after my diagnosis, I had not placed so many individuals at risk because I was on a constant high. And so because I was on a constant high, my adherence to my ARV medication was not good. Um, I would skip I would skip meds because I'd be constantly engaged in chemsex, and that was my lived reality for those first few years. And I look back at it as not one of my proudest moments, but I look back at it as one of my greatest lessons. It really has become my greatest lesson. Um, I still have individuals who I engaged with in that sexualized environments who now find out or have found out after our experiences that I was living with HIV, who would confront me, and they, the terminology of consent was very important. Also noting that your health is your responsibility. And so trying as a young man at the time to strike a balance between everything that was happening, as well as really experiencing all of these things for the first time, it was overwhelming. And many of us are overwhelmed when we first indulge in chemsex or in substance use. Many of us do it from a point of wanting to experiment, um, and then it spirals out of control, really. And so in this October month, we observe, mental health awareness and what that really looks like, to me as a person living with HIV, as a person living with bipolar mood disorder, which is a chronic mental condition, having to take treatment, chronic medication for both. What does a good mental health, well-being state look like to me as an individual? And to me, it really does look like me not being put in a position to deny mentally, emotionally, and physically who I am as an individual. That really is what it looks like to me. And I when we were planning this webinar, one of the first things I had said was that we use the language that is used when people engage in Chemsex. We use the language which is commonly used on the streets by students, by individuals, so that you as students could understand really what we were talking about. And so for me, trying to maintain a good mental health state was difficult. It still is difficult. It's a daily decision I have to make. Am I going to take my ARVs today? If I don't take my ARVs today, then how is that going to look for me? If I don't take my lithium for my bipolar, how is that going to look for me as an individual? And so really, in order for me to maintain that state, I have to be, first of all, adherent to my meds because that's going to keep me alive. Second of all, I run. It's become my thing nowadays. I run. It helps me escape from the workload, from life, from things I carry as an activist, as an HIV activist within the LGBTI community, but also the broader community. I do things like hiking. I love being in nature. Just even being with friends. That is how you maintain your good mental health state. It's practical things that are going to keep you going and that is going to motivate you to continue moving forward. And so before this webinar started, I had asked, what am I supposed to be talking about? And the others laughed because I really wasn't sure what I was supposed to be talking about. If there's any advice I can give you, it is, and I wish that this advice was given to me, was that you're going to experience things in life that wasn't given to you at birth. There was no book handed to you. And so you're going to experience things in life that is going to throw you curveballs. Your studies are going to be pressurized. You're going to be pressurized to perform. And that just is the norm of what they call academia. If you are in a working environment, you're going to be pressurized to meet certain deadlines. How you deal with that pressures and stress levels is up to you. The difference is when you bring chems into that equation, when you bring Chemsex into that equation, it's a different equilibrium that you're reaching. And I was lucky enough while I was engaging in chems that there was always a harm reduction buddy looking out for me. There was always someone more experienced than I was. There was always someone that was looking at the dosages. There was always someone looking out for me. Many people aren't as lucky to have that someone looking out for them, and so Sive has put forth a lot of information, and I hope that this recording will be shared with you afterwards. But really, harm reduction and chemsex and mental health all in one sentence. I never thought that it would be possible, but it is possible. It is possible if we only open ourselves up to being educated. And I think that over the years, I've discovered that that has been the downfall of many individuals. They've not wanted to be educated on things which they thought they knew about. I celebrate 20 years of living with HIV, and I've survived um, the stigma of mental health condition. Um, but more than that, I continue to thrive. I continue to undertake things that are going to give me a thrill in life, and that is not always substances. That is not always chemsex. As good as it may be at times, um, there's always something better. And I think that for me is what puts things into perspective, is when I'm able to, as an individual, know that my no is no and my yes is yes. Am I going to engage in chemsex tonight and I know I have an exam tomorrow? No. Am I going to engage in chemsex and I have a report which is due? No. And that is what really what accountability and responsibility means to me as an individual. Being able to say yes and know that I'm going to be able to manage whatever I'm saying yes to, and being able to say no, I don't have the bandwidth for that. So in closing, I think that is what I'm going to leave you with, is accountability and responsibility starts and ends with you as an individual. I could have many years ago decided to stop taking the ARVs, or indulge in more chems than I knew my body could handle. But I chose me first, and I chose to put my mental health first. So yeah, I hope that you all will be okay on your own journey. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dorian. Thank you so much for coming and sharing in the space with us. I'm going to hand over to Sheena. We've been talking about consent. And so over to you, Sheena, to just give us, what's the current definition of consent with regards to, issues of sexual offences and the SA legal framework. Thank you so much.
So, evening, everybody. There you go. My name is Dr. Sheena Swemmer, and I'm from the Centre for Applied Legal Studies. Won't go into all the information around that. But what I'm focusing on today is consent within the scope of Chemsex. And I must admit, this is really new to me as well. And I hadn't considered a lot of the legal implications of Chemsex. And when my colleague had mentioned how you really can't even approach the police because you're engaging in an unlawful activity, I hadn't even considered the scope of that. And we hear similar things around sex work. And I think from what we've heard from the previous two speakers is really goes well into what I'm going to speak about. And it's about how the law does and doesn't and is and isn't fit to deal with any, not only chemsex, but any kind of situation where you may not be able to give consent in the way that the law acknowledges. So to begin with, I am going to, there we go. I'm going to set out just very briefly what the Sexual Offences Act says, and I'm going to try and make it as easy as possible for those who, which is most of you, don't actually do law. But in terms of the Sexual Offences Act, we have a whole bunch of different kinds of sexual violations. There can be rape, there can be attempted rape, there can be grooming, but for this evening, we're going to focus predominantly on rape. So in terms of the act, and all of what you guys need to know is all of these things, all of these factors have to be proven by the prosecution, so by the state. and they don't have to be disproven by the accused. So the first one is an unlawful and an intentional act. And the intentional part of that is the really important part and what we're going to focus on as we go, because when you are under the influence of a substance, is intention easy as we would think to prove and disprove. The next factor is sexual penetration of another person. So that has to be proven by the state. And finally, without their consent. This is how we currently define rape. So we can see from this that we have two very interesting terms that carry a lot of weight with them, legal weight with them, and legal historical ways of ascertaining them, but they don't really work well with modern situations such as chemsex. So moving on. When we look at things like consent, it has to be, and I'm going to show you later, it has to be given freely. And we use a whole lot of these things from contract law. So, you know, when you buying something, do you understand the essential elements of the contract, of the transaction? That's the limiting thing about law, is we use a lot of those types of thresholds and that kind of reasoning with regards to criminal offenses. But our law does acknowledge that if there are certain factors that may be present, it can show that there was a lack of consent. So if somebody was asleep or unconscious, intoxicated to the point of incapacity, that's important, and we'll definitely keep circling that. Threatened or coerced, deceived about the nature or identity. So if you're deceived into thinking it's one type of sexual encounter and it's another, that can negate your consent. But also, if you are deceived about the identity of the person you're engaging in a sexual encounter with, and very popular, I say popular, but case law has highlighted things like if there were twins and you were assuming you were having sex with one of the twins and it's in actual fact the other twin, that negates your consent. And then the next one is also something that we're now going to see in relation to chemsex, is being unable to appreciate the nature of the act. And that really comes from legalizing human interactions, is are you able to appreciate the essential elements? This is me speaking law, but are you able to appreciate what you will be engaging in and the consequences thereof? So you can see the law really puts a high threshold on what individuals have to, should be and have to have in order for consent to be present. But as we'll see, and as we have seen from my colleagues, is that it doesn't always work. And then finally, and this is also something I picked up from some of the research I did around chemsex, is around power imbalances. And we think of power imbalances of in the context of students. You think of your lecturers; they have an unequal authority over you. But we have them in other ways. We can have power imbalances by gender. We can have power imbalances by socioeconomic status. So all of these things can negate consent. But ultimately, state must prove it. And because a lot of these incidents have, we always usually said he said, she said, because, you know, we're heteronormative ideas, but it could be he said. And the only person often there to give evidence for the state is the victim. And that means the victim has to prove that they didn't consent. In relation to intoxication, our Sexual Offences Act explicitly acknowledges that your capacity can be inhibited or can be reduced. So the Act says, and there's my typo that I fixed. That's why I was going to use my own, so I'm dying here that there's a typo. But the Act says that if you're so affected by intoxicating liquor or any drug or other substance as to be incapable of appreciating the nature of the sexual act concerned. So you see, we're coming back to this appreciation, and that's quite a high threshold. So a lot of people may, in fact, not reach the threshold of having consented, but they ultimately bear the burden of proving that. So when intoxication removes the ability to understand or choose, consent ceases to exist. So it is a very beautiful act, a beautiful idea, but the proof comes down to you having to show it in a court, which creates numerous pitfalls and barriers to justice. So in relation, let me just move on to the next one. So in order to have consent in relation to sexual offences, it has to be voluntary, it has to be uncoerced, and you have to be capable of understanding the act. Moving on to this. So this is where I looked at the what the current model of consent looks at in our law, and what the reality in this kind of chemsex environment may be, and how the law maybe doesn't actually adequately serve these types of situations. So in the consent model, it assumes people have free choice. And the reality in relation to chemsex is free choice might be limited not only by things like being intoxicated, but it may also be limited in other ways. So you see peer pressure, you see dependency. And when you have the burden to prove all of that in a court, it becomes a very traumatic experience because you have to put all of this information forward. So the current model also focuses on one moment. The law, although our case law does say, it must be a continuum of consent, it is hyper-focusing on and around that moment when perhaps a rape did occur. So the law doesn't actually, it's not moving towards a place where it can acknowledge involving, as I said, it involves ongoing social and chemical context. It doesn't have space for that at this point. So it's very limiting in that regard. And then this is something that does happen with the law, and we constantly work against it, is the law assumes that yes means yes and no means no, but sometimes yes can mean no. And sometimes you're intoxicated and yes can mean no, and sometimes you haven't said yes, but your reactions say no. And we see this a lot in case law because of these systems where we don't acknowledge that coercive circumstances can negate consent. Judges often fall into this kind of discriminatory view, or we say believing rape stereotypes, where you would have said yes or you would have said no if you were really being raped. So we see how discrimination often enters into these things and really affects the outcome of cases. So and my colleagues have touched on this a bit, but sexual offences and the justice system in general, and very specifically, I want to say victims of male sexual violence, both male victims and perpetrators, is discrimination and prejudice. Is that, as my colleagues had said, is you're going to get discriminated against when you walk into the police station. They're going to say you're a man, so why didn't you fight back? This is besides the factors of that you were already engaging in a conduct that isn't seen as legal in relation to drug use. But being a male victim of sexual violence is already something that is it's a difficult burden to have to go to a police station and have them believe you, have them not judge you, and then also have them investigate the case. I say an unsympathetic system, and this is not only the police, this is prosecutors and judges. Prosecutors have the discretion over which cases they are going to proceed with, and they go for the easy wins. So they'll go for cases where you would have often a woman victim where she was beaten and held down and raped, and she didn't fall into any of those rape myth categories. But when you're now having someone who is a man, first of all, and then engaging in perhaps sexual encounters with other men or gender diverse people, you can see how the discrimination builds. And prosecutors know that we're in a system that is discriminatory, how are you going to proceed on a case like that? Because you're going to then be coming before a judge that's discriminatory. So they really focus on winnable cases, of which these I don't think, I think because of discrimination, they are not easily winnable. Then I keep saying the burden on the survivor. So the poor individual has to go and tell their story to a court. Then they have to be cross-examined. And cross-examined is as bad as it looks on TV. It is traumatic for the individual. It's traumatic for those who hear it. It's a lot. And then not the ultimate, but the final thing is just generally a terrible conviction rate in South Africa. So and I'm noting my time, I need to finish up. The National Prosecuting Authority will often say they have a 70% rate of prosecutions. This is of cases they decide to take on, and they really only take on winnable cases. But in a study we did some years ago, if you look at reporting, so you go from reporting stage at the police station to those that are resulting in conviction, it's only about 8% of cases. And then I'm saying to you that it is going to be more difficult if you do not fit into that kind of, it's usually a white woman stereotype that isn't drinking, that's wearing clothes that she didn't ask for it and things like that. So all those layers of discrimination come in again. So I'm going to end off with this and the closing thought. So Carl's recently we were in the court the Constitutional Court to challenge how we define consent, but also we've argued, and judgment will only probably come out in a year because the Court is like that. But we've argued that the victim shouldn't have to prove their non-consent. It should be a focus on coercive circumstances, and that if the accused says that consent was present, they should bear the burden of proving it, just like in other violent crimes. So if you think of something like, if you think about assaulting someone, if the accused wants to say that this was actually Fight Club and they all consented to it, they have the burden to prove it. But we don't do that in rape cases. So we'll see how that goes in the future. But just to close off, the question is not only did they say yes, which is how judges often interpret the law. It is about saying, could they have said no in the circumstances? It's about looking at those coercive conditions. And that's kind of what Culs has been pushing towards, and hopefully the Concord takes on. And then consent is not a single moment, it must be continuous. So, people will often say, you took, perhaps you used the drugs, you consented initially, but no, you can change your mind at any time, just as you would change your mind. A colleague said that they enjoyed running. If you run for 5 minutes and decide you don't want to carry on, you're not bound by that. You can decide not to. And that's where we want to be moving towards in terms of the law says that, but in terms of how judges apply the law. So in closing, the law has to move with these types of activities that are taking place and will continue to take place. And the law has to start expanding in the ways it sees consent. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Sheena. I think we're going to now move over to Charity, the Executive Director of Students for Sensible Drug Policy, because we are having this within our university space. We're going to talk about student advocates in these safer spaces and trauma-informed care. So over to you, Charity.
So I'm Charity Monareng, as Daniela said, and I will be basically speaking on some experiences of some of our chapters across the world that have managed to actually change university policies, which have been very zero tolerance policies when it comes to drug use, and have really shifted towards implementing harm reduction policies within universities. So just to also say that the war on drugs, as much as we seem to assume that it only it is only restricted to the criminal justice space. It has infiltrated into different systems that people navigate. So education systems have employed their own type of war on drugs, employment systems as well, but also labor systems. Great. So who is SSDP International? So we're the largest grassroots network of students and young people advocating for sensible drug policies with chapters in various countries. We work to empower young leaders to engage in advocacy and also promote harm reduction strategies. So as I mentioned, the war on drugs has come, and we see its expression in universities, but also in schools, where universities really have zero tolerance policies, where if a young person or a student is found to have been using drugs, it often results in expulsion, suspensions for any drug use, and these still dominate many campuses. There's also this emphasis on law enforcement and punishment, which creates an adversarial climate between students and university officials, which really undermines the trust and the ability of schools to be safe spaces for learning and support. And as I mentioned, education institutions have mirrored criminal drug war tactics using surveillance, so drug tests, random checks, raids, and also harsh discipline, effectively turning campuses from places of growth into places of punishment and miseducation. So students fear seeking help. So in a survey that was conducted by one of our chapters in the UK, nearly half of the students in the survey said that their university's policies was a barrier to them getting support, and 37% of them feared the consequences of actually coming forward. The punitive approach pushes problems into the shadows instead of solving them. So trauma-informed care versus punitive policies. So punishment is not prevention. I know that a lot of universities, but politics and politicians in general tend to assume that by punishing people means that you're preventing them from using drugs. But the decades of just saying no and zero tolerance rhetoric have not created drug-free campuses. Instead, they've really turned schools into punitive environments that often mismanage or ignore real issues. Trauma-informed care really means recognizing that students who use drugs or have a Chemsex-related incident might be dealing with past trauma or other struggles. And instead of discipline that could re-traumatize them, a trauma-informed response offers safety support as well as counseling. Inclusive policies really ensure that campus rules and services are all inclusive for students. This includes culturally competent and LGBTQI+ affirming resources that guarantees that seeking help won't lead to punishment. So this is just a case study from one of our chapters. So an example is the University College London. It acknowledged that its zero tolerance policy drug stance was harmful and damaging because it stopped students from reaching out for help out of fear of being punished. And in response, the UCL shifted to a harm reduction model as part of their broader wellness strategy, integrating education, early intervention, as well as support services. So notably, UCL still enforces rules against drug dealing, so you cannot sell substances on campus, so you will get in trouble for selling or endangering others, but students struggling with personal drug use are met with care, not automatic discipline, and this is a trauma-informed policy in practice. So you can find this harm reduction policy from UCL online, but also some of the examples that I will speak about can be found online. And it's really been a champion. All these moves and shifts in the university policies have really been championed by our chapters in the UK. So how students can advocate for safer spaces, organize and educate peers. Change often starts with students coming together. So forming and joining student groups often focus on harm reduction. So for example, an SSDP chapter or a campus harm reduction club. These clubs can run peer education and safe drug use and consent, distribute informational resources, but also break silences. Student activists, for example, at Durham and UCL used open letters and student forums to push the universities to reconsider harsh drug policies. And their message, students want health-centered policies, not policies that put them in danger by forcing issues underground. So what students can also do is pushing for harm reduction services on campus, so working with student unions and administrators to pilot practical safety measures. A lot of events happen on school campuses, and there are no services to ensure that students are partying safely. So really ensuring that there's drug checking kits, free condom and lube distribution, hydration stations at campus parties, naloxone training for opioid overdoses, And then in the UK, SSDP students activists got their student unions to provide free region drug testing kits and also basic drug education for students. So moving away from this drugs will kill you, don't do drugs, and really giving them the correct information about either the harms that drugs can do to you, but also equipping them with information to make informed decisions. But also collaborating with campus health and counseling centers so students can partner and with health services to ensure they are welcoming and prepared to help. This might mean co-organizing workshops on consent and substance use. We've been able to do this with the Social Sciences Society at Wits, where we've given them some funding to host forums where they can have a safe space to discuss substance use, but also really just educating them and allowing them to talk about drugs and the issues that they experience on campus relating to tobacco and substances as well. Using student voices in policy debates, so participating in university governance where possible, to join task forces, student council meetings, or policy reviews on drugs and alcohol issues. A lot of our chapters have not only moved the advocacy from the universities, but are also championing national policy changes. But also the media is your ally too. So writing op-eds in campus newspapers, running social media campaigns, but also hosting public forums. The louder and more constructively you make the case, the harder it is for leadership to ignore. So rethinking faculty policies, there needs to be an audit of existing policies, and university faculty and administrators need to start having honest reviews of their policies, which might perpetuate the problem. So zero tolerance rules, punitive residence hall contracts, or policies that discipline students for moral turpitude, creating a chilling effect. A policy that automatically suspends a student for the first-time drug fraction, for instance, may actually increase harm by isolating that student and discouraging others from getting help. And we're not only seeing this in universities, it's also happening in schools where learners are actually being disciplined and expelled from schools for using substances or being excluded from schools for their substance use. So really, we need to start treating drug use as a health issue and not a crime, a health and social issue. So faculty can champion reframing the approach. The goal should be to support students' well-being as the first priority and not to enforce prohibition for its own sake. So an example is that Durham University's leadership did exactly this. Their new policy explicitly states that students' drug use will be handled as a welfare matter as the first recourse. So replacing punitive measures with supportive ones, policies need concrete changes, not just kind words. So for instance, rewriting disciplinary codes so that if a student is found using drugs or alcohol in any risky way, the response is a referral to counseling and not forced counseling, health services or an educational program and not immediate suspension. But also adopting amnesty in sexual misconduct policies. So one faculty policy that often perpetuates harm is when a student who reports sexual assault, and I think as Sheena mentioned as well, because you're already engaging in a criminal offense by using substances, so they can be penalized for the associated behavior of either underage drinking, drug use, but also being at an unauthorized party. So this deters survivors from reporting, especially in chemsex scenarios. So we need to also invest in training and resources. Transformation doesn't stop at rewriting rules. It requires equipping people to enact them. So training campus security, resident advisors, faculty, but also health staff on harm reduction and trauma-informed responses. But also engaging students in policy developments. Faculties should not dictate changes from an ivory tower. We need to embrace the mantra of nothing about us without us. So including student representatives, especially from relevant groups, in the policy redesign process. So these are just examples of the universities that have reformed their policies from zero tolerance policies to more harm reduction focused policies. So UCL, Durham University, Newcastle University, Leeds, but also beyond these cases, other UK campuses are moving in the same direction. Students at Bristol, Manchester, and elsewhere are also successfully advocating for things like on-site drug testing at events, but stronger support for these services as well. So bringing everyone on board, students can continue to be the spark for change. So talking to peers, sharing information, and organizing university staff and administrators to be champions from within. So using your influence to prioritize student health in policy discussions. Something as simple as a professor voicing that I'd rather have a student come to me for help for their drug problem than suffer on their own can really shift attitudes. Mental health practitioners and campus health services, advocating loudly for trauma-informed care in your practice and to the university leadership. You often see firsthand the fallout of punitive policies that students who won't mention their substance use in therapy for fear of repercussions, or the survivor of assault who is afraid campus authorities will discipline them. And then policy advocates like myself, but also maybe a few on the call, and NGOs to really connect the campus movements to broader drug policy reform agenda, where you're in a community organization, a legal advocacy group, or a national network, lending your expertise to students and faculty to try and make changes. Funders and donors, investing in solutions and not punishments. Often universities stick to punitive approaches because they think implementing new programs is too costly or risky, and then philanthropists and funding bodies can change that calculus. So funding peer education programs, campus recovery centers, or research into student substance use. So it does take a village to transform a campus, so including everyone in this process, because everyone has a unique role to play. So the war on drugs mentality has no place in schools or in our universities. Its legacy in education, fear, punishment, and stigma has failed our students. Students are not criminals. They're individuals with potential, challenges, and hopes. When a student uses drugs or has a chemsex experience, it doesn't mean they deserve condemnation. It just means that they deserve information, they deserve support as well as care. And then harm reduction is love in action. It's a philosophy that says we value students' lives and health unconditionally, even if they take risks. It's pragmatic, accepting that some drug use happens, and focuses on keeping students safe above all. By adopting harm reduction and trauma-informed practices, universities reaffirm their role as nurturers of growth and learning. They also align with public health evidence that this approach works. And then, of course, nothing about us without us. This rallying cry must continue guiding us. Students, keep leading, keep sharing your lived experiences, and insist on having a seat at the table. Your insight is invaluable and non-negotiable in crafting solutions that actually work. Administrators and policymakers continue to listen and include these voices, because policies made with community will always outperform policies made for community without its input. Thank you so much. And these are just pictures of some of the activities from our chapters across the world. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Charity. Let me just move on to Rebecca. And I think, Rebecca, your role will probably be like a rapporteur, but do note, no pressure are you speaking on behalf of faculty. But just your reflections, Rebecca, as a faculty member, and possibly just giving some guidance as to what you've heard from all the presenters, and just possibly giving us a thought of where to from now. So over to Rebecca, who is a lecturer in the Division of Clinical Associates.
Thank you so much, Daniela, and thank you to all of my colleagues that have presented before me. So as Daniela has said, so my contribution this evening will just focus on how faculty and academic staff can translate this trauma-informed principles into our daily teaching, our supervision, our policy engagement. And then I'd also like to just draw a link between, mental health being on a continuum, as well as our student experiences in accessing care on campus. And as Charity has already mentioned, quite a few ways that we can engage these policies and change. So we'll just be speaking around that for a little while. So firstly, I'd like to thank Dorian for sharing his lived experience so openly with us. I think that just really, your story brings to life the complexity of mental health, and it reminds us that wellness and distress are not opposites, but it's part of the same continuum. And so when we talk about mental health, we often imagine it as either sick or well. But in reality, most of us move fluidly, or we oscillate along the spectrum depending on our circumstances, our stresses, and the support that's available to us. And I think your reflection just highlighted how how Chemsex practices can sometimes represent connection, curiosity, pleasure, but they can also intersect with trauma, stigma, as well as your social isolation. And so for many students, these experiences happen in the context of exclusion and limited access to affirming care. It's not just about behavior. It's about belonging, safety, and coping in the unsupportive environments. So as we move into the next section, I want to explore how faculty, through our daily language and our micro interactions with students, can either reinforce the stigma or build safety. And every conversation, every piece of feedback, every lecture example is an opportunity for us to make mental health visible and valued. So over the past few days, I actually deliberately went out and tried to have a chat with some of the students, and specifically the Wits students, and about the experiences in trying to access mental health services, well-being services on campus, substance use services, as well as the LGBTQ plus community, what services they have available. And their stories were quite sobering. So I'll start off with just to say that some of these services that are advertised across the campuses are not as easily accessible as we would have liked them to be, or as much as we made to believe that it would be. I'll just take one, for instance. The Wits RHI clinic has a dedicated clinic specifically for LGBTQ plus population groups, and that clinic has actually closed down due to funding losses. So this is a service that's no longer available, for instance. There is now a service that is available, but it's only available on a Thursday afternoon at a designated spot on main campus, which then excludes other campuses. So this just highlights that, as much as we say there are these services available on campus, it's not always accessible by the students that may require them. They also found it to be quite a judgmental space. There was a bit of fear in accessing the services, especially around substance use, because there is this fear, this idea that we still don't do drugs. There's still an approach to don't do drugs, and there's a lot of legalities around if you are found with substances in your possession, that legal action might be taken. You could be suspended from campus. So it's quite punitive around that. So a lot of the students don't actually access these services because of the fear of the action that might be taken. So what this tells us is that even within progressive institutions, there's still a disconnect between the intention and access. And the policies sound supportive, but the reality feels quite restrictive for the students. So I guess the question for us as faculty becomes, how can we make our classrooms, the clinical spaces, our referral systems more open and affirming and responsive to the realities? So language shapes culture, and culture in turn shapes care. So when we talk about chemsex, consent, or mental health, the words we choose either open the space for the dialogue or it reinforces stigma. So instead of asking what's wrong with you, we could change our language and say, what's happening for you? Those small shifts moves the conversation from blame to curiosity, and from pathology to understanding. And I think that sometimes we are quite guilty of pathologizing a lot of behavior instead of trying to understand it and see it from that perspective. So as educators or clinicians, we're often the first point of contact when a student is struggling, and recognizing these subtle distress signals, withdrawal, missed classes, emotional flatness, this allows us to listen before we label students or student behavior. And simple visibility actions matter. Having pronouns in our emails, using inclusive case examples, leaving the door literally open during consultations, and even the corridor conversations that we have, and not divulging it to the rest of the team, for instance. I think those are things that we could certainly implore on. So I really liked what Charity has presented, and those are some of the trauma-informed care principles and how we can integrate those into our policies at within the division, as well as the larger community within the faculty and in the university as a whole. And there's just one that I'd like to draw on. So there are some like safety, trust, choice, collaboration that is highlighted, but there's one in particular that I'd like to draw on, and that's empowerment. How do we actually enforce, or how do we encourage this? And I was just thinking about the work that Michael Unga has done around resilience. And he says that it isn't just a personal threat, but it's the ability to navigate and negotiate for the social, cultural, and environmental resources that sustain well-being, especially in adversity. And so we realize that resilience is actually co-created between the person and the environment. And so if we think about us at university, we are part of the students' environment. And so trauma-informed care isn't only about a therapy room, but it could also apply to us in the classrooms, in the lecture halls, in supervision, in assessment feedback as well, and even how we design policies that shape belonging. And I think that we also need to own that part of the resources that we provide to students when we say that they need to be more resilient. It's actually a co-creation of resilience. Then I just also want to take a quick moment to link our conversation to what's happening at a national level. So as Daniela has already said at the opening, that we do have our first national harm reduction guidelines for Chemsex that was published. And so this guideline recognized that Chemsex isn't always harmful, but that the risk and the distress that arises at the intersections where there's stigma, criminalization, and a lack of access collide. So it explicitly calls for judgment-free, sex-positive, and inclusive services that address both pleasure and safety, recognizing that people engage in chemsex for various reasons, including intimacy, belonging, and emotional escape. So when we outline these guidelines and what harm reduction services should look like, we want to think around, having services that have sex positive and judgment free, and meeting people where they're at. And I think you've heard it in every presentation tonight, that it's about meeting the person where they're at and providing a service that is appropriate to what they need. Providing accessible prevention tests and care for HIV, STIs, viral hepatitis, and substance use, and offering mental health and psychosocial support using your multidisciplinary approaches. Also promoting your PrEPs and PEP as well as your ART adherence as part of the holistic well-being, and ensuring that we have crisis support, not just on paper, but in reality, something that we can access. As the students once said, that there is a crisis line that we have, but after hours, it's often not answered, or nobody responds to it. So why does this matter to us at faculty? I guess because these aren't just clinical standards, but they're relational principles that we can bring into our classrooms and our tutorials, and being mindful when we are supervising students as well. When we model curiosity instead of judgment, when we create predictable, safe environments, and when we build trust, we are enacting harm reduction as at an educational level. And that's how universities become part of the care ecosystem, not an extension of the problem. So these are just some of the referral pathways, and I think that Sive has also just posted some of the contact details should anyone require any assistance at any point. So after everything we've discussed tonight, the lived experiences, the policy gaps, the national guidelines, the question comes next: what do we actually do next? What does that look like? Because while the guidelines and research gives us a framework, the real transformation happens in our everyday actions as faculty supervisors, mentors, and policy contributors. The first step is to normalize the conversations around mental health and well-being. That could mean starting tutorials or debriefs with a quick check-in, modeling emotional literacy, watching and minding our language that we use when we refer to mental illness or to mental health or well-being, and simply reminding students that help exists and that it's okay to access it. Small things like tone, eye contact, language can communicate care or indifference. So even those micro moments do count. Second, we need to advocate for trauma-informed and harm reduction training. And this needs to be quite realistic and achievable for all teaching and supervisory staff. It's not about turning educators into counselors, of course. I think there is a boundary, but it's about ensuring that our system doesn't re-traumatize a student who already faces structural inequities. When we understand trauma responses, like withdrawal, avoidance, or overcompliance, we stop taking them personally and start responding with empathy and consistency. Thirdly, we can begin reviewing faculty and residents' policies through trauma-informed lenses. Are disciplinary measures around substance use or mental health, are they punitive or do they allow for compassionate interventions? And this is really where I'd like to encourage the students to make their voice heard and to join those societies or join those clubs where you can make contribution to university policies. The harm reduction guidelines, the South African harm reduction guidelines does remind us that abstinence-only policies often push people underground. So if our goal is to keep students safe, our policies has to reflect care and not control. And finally, we need partnership, of course. We don't have to reinvent the wheel. We've got networks like OUT that Sive is from, different engagements, health. There is Students for Sensible Drug Policies, like Charity, where Charity's from. They're already leading the way. So we just need to link up with them and see how we can co-create these referral systems, the peer education programs and safe spaces that genuinely responds to students' realities. So ultimately, culture change begins with care. If we treat disclosure as courage, not misconduct, we begin to build the inclusive, trauma-informed university our students are asking for. And that's what this work is really about. Not just reducing harm, but restoring dignity, connection, and hope. So thank you so much for the opportunity. That's all from me.
Thank you so much, Rebecca. Thank you very, very much to all the speakers. We've run over time, but I don't want to. I think this was a great Q&A, and thank you so much to every single speaker that spoke today. There's a few questions that have been answered, and the chat space has been so busy, but I've picked up a few here, and so one of them, non-stigmatizing data on chemsex practices in South Africa to inform service design and funding allocation.
Just in terms of making services more available and more informed, as well as non-stigmatizing. look, when it comes to just from practical experience, when it comes to the research that Outwell being as well as a whole cohort, it was really just a group work assignment, if I'll put it like that, which was formed with multiple organizations that have years and years of experience, whether we're talking in terms of sexual health or in terms of substance use, chemsex and sexualized drug use, providing services to those. Really, two key aspects that I've detailed much more further in the chat will take priority to me, and that's to make sure that there is consent and privacy for the informers, along with support, of course, during as well as after interviews, because all of this has to be led by the communities themselves, by the people who are having these experiences. They dictate where whatever output, be it research, be it guidelines, be it formation of services, whatever it is that needs to be formed, the pillars of that are the community. They are the foundation from the get-go. And so having that consent as well as privacy, but also trust as one of the leading aspects, always ensures that, you know what, you can keep the community as your brother, your sister, your not just your informant or your piece of data. This is ultimately another human being. And so the golden rule always comes through there. If I wouldn't have it done unto me, why would I do it to someone else? Yeah. Secondly, it's also making sure that you have peers who, as well as an ethical oversight university or institution to keep you accountable. Those are really also the things that make sure that this is not just, you know, a bunch of people who are getting together and forming whatever message that they want. There are principles and processes that are firstly guarded, but also guided throughout the entire, investigation, throughout the formation of those services. And so that's why I really, really think maybe those are the first two, but there's so many more principles that we can keep in mind to inform services. The biggest thing that I will say, though, is that at every stage, we, on the other side of the service desk, should always make sure that we are representing the community. We are there for the population, whoever we are speaking about, be it students, who I'm just so happy that this entire webinar has been organized by the University of Wits, because if our institutions are not safeguarding but also not representing the interests of this community, who else will? So very, very big shout out actually to all of the stakeholders who've come together today. A bigger shout out to everybody who has hopped on this call. Whether you came and left or whether you stayed throughout the entire end, I really want to just say you are the people that are ensuring that, we're not just speaking to a bunch of research. We're not just using this information in a way that is not humanistic. We understand at the end of the day that it all starts usually with that very young gap between 20 and, I don't know if the ANC Youth League still defines youth as 35, but I'll use that as my premise as well. Within that age gap, within that premise, there is always a lot that can happen. So if we can show support as organizations, as institutions, but even as individuals, and this is the challenge I issue out to everyone who leaves here today, go out and try and show support. If anyone comes to you and says, hey, you remember that webinar where those funny people were talking about drugs and sex and all of those weird things? I think I actually do it. First and foremost, practice what you preach. Preaching, of course, being empathy, being compassion, and then also being knowledgeable and saying, hey, these are actually what are, the steps and the things that I learned from that thing. We can go, if you're comfortable, to this faculty member. We can go to the student counseling services, or we can go to the community organization, whether they are in or outside of the university. I guarantee you, we are all here to help. And that's actually our purpose at the end of the day. Excuse for my long-winded answer.
Thank you. There's one important question that I don't want us to miss, and I think if I can direct it to you, Sheena, it's around where would one go if there's a sexual harassment, if they experience sexual harassment from a senior manager or official at work or campus, and what should they do if they are a transgender woman experiencing this violation?
Well, the individuals, they can either contact me and I can assist them in contacting the Gender Equity Office, but Wits has a specific office that deals with any form of discrimination based on gender, all these, gender, sex, all those types of things. But if they want to reach out to me, I can refer them, or they can reach out to the Gender Equity Office. But either way.
Thank you so much. And then maybe Rebecca, can chemsex lead to a substance use disorder?
So yes, I guess it could. It depends on the individual and the frequency. I think also just understanding what a substance use disorder, or the definition of a substance use disorder, it has to cause some sort of dysfunction in your daily activity, in your relationships with other people. And so if you can't, it depends on the, why you have or use or do chemsex. As we saw, there's many reasons why people engage in chemsex. But if it is due to perhaps a poor coping strategy, it could lead ultimately to a substance use disorder. But I guess this is then again around the support structure that you have, when engaging in chemsex. So just being aware of what that means for you.
And then there was a question about the most urgent research data gaps around chemsex in South Africa. And I think just hearing from what Sive said is that whilst we might come up with assumptions, I think what I gathered is it's quite important to ask the community what they think needs to be addressed in research, and that co-creation, co-design from the research question to the protocol actually needs to be informed by the community, and that whatever research you're going to conduct is ultimately going to be around improving the lives of the community, and that it's not people being researched. So I hope that in that way it answers the question. And there's one last one. So with regards to universities, how far are we from demolishing those? Okay, I think this is for Charity, and I think it is an important one. Charity, there's a question around demolishing the no drug policies. Are there talks or meetings ongoing to shift from these strict policies, considering what substance use will increase as it is exam season now? And I think you spoke to some engagements on Wits, but also you can just tell us what SSDP is doing before we close off.
Yeah, our biggest success has been in the UK, and that just really was efforts from the students really organizing. One of the challenges that we've seen as a secretariat for our chapters across Africa is really the bureaucracy of even establishing a chapter within universities, to the point where we've had to change the people that are actually part of our network. So we've moved away from restricting it to just students, but really including young people to be part of chapters. So in terms of university policies, it's still quite contested. Like I said, South Africa is very moralistic in our approach to substance use. And like I said, people's morals really do translate in our education systems. If learners are getting expelled from schools just for substance use, and these are just under 18s that are not even in universities yet. So at least there has been efforts, particularly within the Department of Basic Education, because we're a technical partner. They reviewing the national strategy on drugs and alcohol for learners. So we'll be assisting them in drafting that national strategy. So really trying to see how we can, put more supportive language in there. So we're at least starting to see a shift within the Department of Basic Education. When it comes to universities, it's a lot more complex because of either funding issues as well. I don't think we really we realize how influential specific funding is in terms of what professors can talk about publicly and so forth. So I mean, we can start the conversations. What we've heard from Wits students is exactly what Rebecca was talking about, that I mean, they're not supportive. There's students are frustrated. There's services that universities advertise, but they're not accessible, or they still have this "don't do drugs" narrative. So I think it's like a whole society shift that needs to happen before we can like get it right with universities. But yeah, we're open to working with universities that are open to collaborating and really looking to shift their policies. But we do understand that it is quite complex, but baby steps.
Thank you so much, Charity. And I think that we can close it off on there, and perhaps by just saying the time for student advocacy is now. As you highlighted, is that if it's student driven, and if it's at a grassroots, and that we need to get organized. So I want to thank everybody for being here with us. Thank you so much to the speakers. I hope that we leave the space not just with understanding, but we have a renewed commitment to fostering the safe, inclusive, and compassionate environments, and that the discussion shouldn't end here. Please, it's beginning. The reflecting, the collaboration, the transformation is beginning. So we might be tired. It's exam season, but hopefully, when the recording's out and you watch it again, we find our advocacy feet and our working hands to go into 2026 and beyond. Thank you so much. Keep safe to all the students. Good luck with the assessments. To my fellow educators, good luck with all your marking and getting all the marks ready. Thank you so much, everybody. Keep safe. And until the next one, bye.